Have you ever walked into your home and heard something that froze your heart? He thought it was just another evening until he heard his little girl crying, begging for forgiveness. What he found behind that door would change everything he believed about love and family. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? In the heart of Asheville, where autumn brushed the trees in shades of gold and crimson, stood the Harlan estate, vast, elegant, and heartbreakingly quiet. Each morning, the sun spilled through its tall windows, landing on marble floors that had forgotten the sound of laughter. The house had once been a home, years ago, when a woman's piano melodies floated through its halls, but since she passed, silence had settled like a permanent guest. Elliot Harlan, 52, moved through that silence as if it belonged to him. He was a man of measured steps and perfect posture, his tie always straight, his eyes always distant. The world called him a success, a builder of empires, a man who turned small towns into skylines. Yet inside his own walls, he could not build connection. His life was a calendar of meetings, a collection of contracts, and an emptiness he did not have time to name. Down the grand staircase, his daughter Grace waited for him at the breakfast table. 8 years old, with the kind of quiet brightness that never demands attention, she sat with her hands folded, waiting for her father to notice the drawing she had made before dawn, a tree standing in the rain, its branches reaching upward, stubborn and alive. When Elliot entered, she smiled timidly. "Good morning, Daddy," she whispered. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft but distracted. He looked at his phone instead of the paper, scanned messages about a meeting in New York, and nodded absently when his wife spoke. Vivienne Cross, elegant in her pale silk robe, poured coffee with the grace of someone who had learned long ago how to fill silence with poise. "She'll learn manners, Elliot," she said with a delicate smile, "if someone bothers to teach her." And he gave a polite, half-hearted, and reached for his briefcase. Vivienne's expression never faltered, but her hand tightened slightly on the coffee pot. Grace's small voice tried again. "I drew this for you." She slid the picture across the table. Elliot glanced at it briefly, a flicker of pride crossing his face before he folded it gently and said, "We'll look at it later, sweetheart. I have to run." Her smile trembled but held. "Okay, Daddy." He kissed her forehead, missing how her eyes followed him long after the front door closed. Outside, his car started with a hum that echoed down the marble corridor. The moment the sound faded, the house seemed to exhale and Vivienne's mask slipped. "Pick up that plate, Grace," she said coolly. "You made a mess again." The girl looked at the plate, a single drop of jam near its rim, and reached for a napkin. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't clean," Vivienne said, her tone sharp enough to cut the morning light. "Be quick, and don't touch the piano again." Grace blinked, startled. "But I just wanted to hear—" Vivienne's look silenced her. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken rules. From the hallway, Mrs. Alma Ford, the housekeeper, paused, a dish towel in hand. She had seen this before, the way the woman's coldness froze everything it touched. Alma's eyes softened as she caught Grace's, and she whispered quietly when Vivienne left the room. "He still loves you, honey," Alma said. "He just forgot how to show it." Grace nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. She folded the napkin neatly and set the clean plate back on the table, her small fingers trembling. Outside, the wind rustled through the maples, scattering red leaves across the driveway like whispers of things unsaid. The mansion stood tall and perfect, but inside, it was cracking not with sound, but with absence. Vivienne passed through the doorway, humming faintly to herself. From somewhere upstairs came the faint echo of a piano key. One note, soft, uncertain, then gone. Grace turned toward the sound, her heart lifting for an instant before the silence swallowed it again. Later that morning, the autumn sun slid higher over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting long golden bars across the estate's marble floors. From the upstairs window, Grace watched a squirrel dart across the driveway, clutching an acorn in its tiny paws. The world outside looked free and gentle, a world that belonged to laughter, not whispers. Downstairs, Vivienne's heels clicked sharply against the tiles, the rhythm of control. "Grace, your shoes. They're not polished." "Yes, ma'am," the girl replied softly, rushing to wipe them with the corner of her sleeve. Vivian sighed as if burdened by imperfection itself. "You're too much like her," she murmured, glancing toward a framed photograph of Elliot's late wife, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile frozen forever behind glass. Grace caught the glance, her small chest tightening. "Like who?" she asked. Vivian turned away. "Never mind. I am—" The housekeeper, Alma, reappeared quietly, carrying folded linen. She met Vivian's eyes for a moment, a silent exchange, heavy with disapproval, then turned to Grace and spoke gently. "Sweetheart, you want to help me in the kitchen later? We'll bake those apple hand pies you liked." Grace brightened just a little. "Can I?" "Of course you can, but only if you promise to smile while you mix the dough. That's my rule." Grace nodded solemnly, as if she'd just agreed to something sacred. For a few minutes, the warmth in Alma's voice pushed back the cold edges of the mansion. By noon, Elliot's absence had become a kind of presence. His chair at the head of the table remained untouched, the newspaper folded perfectly beside his untouched coffee cup. Grace stared at it while eating in silence. She imagined him sitting there, asking about her day, maybe smiling at her drawing. But the only sound was the ticking clock and Vivian's phone conversation drifting from the hallway words about charity luncheons and interior designers, things that didn't belong to Grace's world. After lunch, Alma handed Grace a broom, pretending it was part of a game. "Sweep the kitchen floor, young lady. Every crumb tells a story." Grace giggled softly, careful not to be heard. "Even this one?" She pointed at a tiny piece of crust. "Especially that one," Alma said. "That's the ending, the sweet part." When Vivian entered, the laughter stopped. "Is this what I'm paying you for, Alma? Games?" "No, ma'am," Alma said calmly, wiping her hands. "Just keeping spirits clean along with the floors." Vivian didn't respond, only lifted her chin and walked away. The door closed, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume, expensive, sharp, and cold. Grace went back to sweeping, slower now. She glanced toward the piano in the corner, its keys gathering dust. Once, long ago, her mother's fingers had danced across them. Grace touched a single key, just enough to let it sing a tiny sound that shimmered like a memory. Alma looked up but didn't stop her. "That's a good sound," Alma whispered. "Your mama would like that." Grace smiled faintly, pressing one more note before closing the lid gently. Then she gathered the broom and carried it toward the hallway, trying to keep her steps quiet. Her hand brushed against the wall, smooth, cold stone, and she wondered if the house could feel lonely too. Outside, the sky dimmed to a soft gray as clouds rolled in. The afternoon hush deepened, wrapping every room in stillness. Somewhere upstairs, a window slammed shut from the wind, making Grace jump. Alma came running from the pantry, but Vivian only said from the parlor, "It's just the breeze. Don't overreact." Grace returned to the dining room, where her drawing still lay folded beside her father's coffee cup. She picked it up carefully, pressing the creases flat with her small hands. Her throat tightened. "He'll look at it later," she whispered to herself, as if saying it aloud could make it true. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the clock, the wind, the hollow ache that filled the house. When her fingers trembled, the edge of the plate she'd just cleaned slipped from her grasp. It hit the floor with a small, bright sound, one that seemed far too loud in that great, quiet room. Outside, the wind shook the maple leaves loose. Inside, the sound of a small plate breaking echoed, and no one reacted. The plate had been swept away before Elliot came home that night. No one mentioned it. The house looked the same, as always elegant, immaculate, and strangely cold. But Grace could feel something shift, like a thin crack forming in glass. It wasn't loud or visible, just there, running quietly beneath everything. The next afternoon, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, dust dancing in the beams like gold threads. Vivian sat in the parlor, arranging roses that didn't smell like anything real. Derek Cross, her younger brother, lounged on the sofa, a tumbler of bourbon sweating in his hand. He wore a smirk that made Alma, the housekeeper, mutter under her breath whenever he appeared. "Elliot's still in New York?" he asked lazily. Vivian nodded without looking up. "Board meetings. He won't be back until Friday." Derek grinned. "Then we have peace, huh? No one to lecture about discipline." Vivian's lips curled. "Discipline builds character. That child needs structure." "Oh, Grace, standing quietly in the hallway, didn't understand what structure meant. But she understood the tone, the one that made her stomach tighten. She turned away and walked upstairs to her small reading nook beneath the stairs, a place Alma had helped her make cozy, with a blanket and a small lamp. There, Grace opened her sketchbook. Between drawings of trees and clouds, one page showed her mother a memory more than a likeness. The woman's hair was long, her smile gentle. Above it, in childish handwriting, Grace had written, "Mom always said rain means God is washing sadness away." She traced the letters with her finger, whispering, "Maybe it'll rain soon." Downstairs, Derek's laughter filled the hall. Alma stepped out of the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron. She caught Grace's eyes and smiled softly. "Hey there, sunshine. Want to help me with something later? Maybe a pie?" Grace nodded eagerly. "Can I bring my drawing to show Daddy when he comes back?" "Of course you can, honey." Alma leaned down and whispered, "And don't let anyone tell you it's not good enough. You hear me?" Grace grinned. "I hear you." From the parlor, Vivian's voice sliced through their small moment of warmth. "Alma, she's not your child. Let her finish her homework." "Yes, ma'am." Alma replied quietly, her smile fading but her eyes kind. "Come on, sweetheart. Go on now." Grace carried her notebook to the study where her father usually Saturday. She climbed onto the big leather chair, her feet swinging. The desk smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. On one corner sat a silver photo frame of Elliot and his late wife, the same picture Vivienne kept downstairs, but this one wasn't hidden under glass reflections. Grace looked at it for a long time, whispering, "He still remembers you, Mama. He has to." A sound from the hallway made her jump. Derek appeared at the door, his tie loosened, his smile not quite friendly. "Well, what do we have here? Little Miss Quiet? In the boss's chair?" Grace froze. "I was just snooping, huh? You shouldn't touch grown-up things." He reached forward and closed her sketchbook roughly, dust puffing up from the table. "Run along." She slid off the chair, clutching her notebook tight. "Yes, sir." He watched her go, sipping his drink again. Kids these days. No manners. In the kitchen, Alma was washing apples when Grace slipped back in, eyes glossy. Without asking, Alma wiped her hands and pulled the girl into a gentle hug. "Don't mind him, sweetheart. Some folks talk just to hear themselves." Grace sniffed. "He said I shouldn't draw." Alma smiled sadly. "Then draw twice as much." The oven clicked on, filling the kitchen with warmth. Grace stood on a stool to reach the counter, while Alma handed her slices of apple to arrange on the crust. "You see, every pie needs sweetness," Alma said. "It's what keeps the crust from cracking." Grace tilted her head. "People too?" Alma laughed softly. "Especially people." For a while, the house felt alive again. The smell of cinnamon and butter spread through the air, soft and homely. Even Vivienne paused in the hallway, eyes narrowing as if the scent itself were an act of defiance. She said nothing, just turned and walked away, her perfume fading behind her like cold smoke. Outside, clouds began to gather. A hush settled over the mountains, heavy with the promise of rain. Grace pressed her face to the window, fogging the glass with her breath. Somewhere in that stillness, she thought she heard her father's voice, not words, just the feeling of him. "Daddy," she whispered, "please come home soon." The rain started just after dusk, the kind that comes quietly at first, a soft patter against the glass, a sigh through the trees. Grace loved that sound. It felt like someone whispering a promise that everything bad would wash away. She sat by the window, sketchbook open on her lap, pencil moving slowly as she drew raindrops falling over a small house. A light shone from the window in her drawing, warm and steady. In real life, the only light came from the chandelier overhead, too bright and too cold. Vivian's voice echoed down the hallway. "Grace, lights out soon. You have schoolwork tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied. She wasn't in school yet. Private tutors came twice a week. But Vivienne called it school anyway structure, she said. The girl gathered her things, closing the sketchbook gently. She paused before slipping it under her pillow, the safest place she knew. Then she reached for the small picture she kept of her mother, a worn photograph tucked in a locket. The edges were frayed, the color faded, but the smile never changed. Grace whispered, "Good night, Mommy," before turning off her lamp. Downstairs, the mood was different. Vivian sat by the fireplace, a glass of white wine resting on her knee. Derek lounged across from her, flipping through a magazine about luxury homes. The fire crackled, casting flickers of orange light across their faces. "You're really going through with it?" Derek asked, his tone lazy but curious. Vivian swirled her wine. "The trust fund transfers automatically once Grace turns 10. 2 more years, maybe less if Elliot signs the new document. He won't even notice he never does." Derek whistled softly. "You always did know how to pick your marks." Vivian's eye hardened. "It's called survival." Neither of them noticed Alma standing just outside the doorway, holding a tray. She froze, her heart pounding. For a moment, she thought to speak, but the look on Vivian's face stopped her. She retreated quietly to the kitchen, setting the tray down and pressing a hand to her chest. "Lord," she whispered, "watch over that little girl." Later, as the rain grew heavier, Grace awoke to muffled voices downstairs. Curiosity pulled her from bed. She tiptoed down the carpeted stairs, clutching her sketchbook like a shield. From the landing, she could see Vivian standing near the fireplace, her reflection caught in the tall mirror, beautiful, perfect, and sharp as glass. Derek had gone. Only the echo of his laughter lingered. Vivian noticed the child's reflection behind her. "Why are you out of bed?" Grace froze. "I heard talking." "There's nothing for you to hear," Vivian replied, turning back to the fire. "Go upstairs." Grace hesitated. "Can I show you something first?" She opened her sketchbook, revealing a page she'd drawn that afternoon, a tree by the lake, its branches shaped like open arms. "It's our house," she said softly. "See? With the tree Mama planted." In pride, Vivian glanced at the drawing without expression. "It's messy," she said finally. "The lines are uneven." Grace bit her lip. "I'll try harder." "You should," Vivian murmured. "Perfection is what keeps the world from falling apart." Grace closed her book and climbed the stairs slowly. Each step creaked under her small feet. When she reached the top, she turned once, watching Vivian still by the fire, her shadow long and motionless on the wall. In the kitchen, Alma had fallen asleep in her chair, the faint smell of cinnamon still clinging to the air. The pie from earlier sat untouched on the counter, cooling beneath a towel. Grace smiled faintly and whispered, "We'll eat it tomorrow, Alma." She tiptoed back to her room, slipping under the covers, listening to the steady drum of rain. She didn't notice that her sketchbook had fallen open on the floor, the drawing half hidden beneath the rug, a tree, a house, and in the corner, small words she'd written in pencil, "Daddy, please come home soon." Hours later, long after the fire downstairs had dimmed, Vivian walked through the darkened hall. Her eyes caught the silver frame on the piano, the photo of Elliot's late wife, smiling softly at some distant memory. She lifted it from the stand, tracing a manicured finger along its edge. "You had your time, darling," she whispered to the photograph. Her voice was low, almost tender. "Now it's mine." The clock struck midnight. Outside, thunder rolled over the mountains, echoing through the empty halls like a warning no one wanted to hear. The storm had not stopped. It rolled through Asheville all night, sweeping leaves into the gutters and painting the windows with rain. By morning, the mountains were wrapped in fog, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. At the Harlan estate, Grace sat quietly by the piano, tracing her fingers along the keys without pressing them. Her reflection in the polished surface looked like another child, altogether pale, serious, waiting. Down the hall, Vivian's voice drifted like smoke. "The maid's been too lenient," she said to Derek, who had returned with a newspaper under his arm. "That child needs to learn boundaries." Derek smirked. "You sound like Mother again." Vivian frowned. "Don't start." Alma, polishing silverware nearby, pretended not to hear. But she caught the way Vivian's words slid between cruelty and control, like a knife being sharpened slowly. Upstairs, Grace opened her sketchbook to a new page. She drew a window streaked with rain and a small figure looking out. Then she took the locket from under her shirt and whispered to it, "I'll call him today, Mama. I promise." In New York, 300 miles away, Elliot Harlan stood before a boardroom window, the skyline glittering behind him. His phone vibrated on the conference table, but he didn't look down. He was deep in a presentation, his voice steady and polished, describing profits, forecasts, and growth words that made sense to everyone but him. When it rang again, one of his associates whispered, "Sir, do you need to take that?" "No," Elliot said, glancing at the caller ID. "It's home." His throat tightened, but he kept speaking. He finished his speech with applause from the table, yet he couldn't shake the unease curling in his stomach. Something about the timing, the rain, the silence in his chest felt wrong. He reached for the phone, saw a voicemail waiting, and pressed play. The room faded around him. "Daddy, please, I can't do this anymore." Grace's voice was small, broken by hiccups of breath. There was a clatter in the background, a woman's voice shouting, muffled and sharp, then silence. Just the rain. Elliot froze. For a second, he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the chair scraped back, the room spinning slightly, as he stood. "Elliot," his assistant called, confused. He grabbed his coat. "Reschedule everything," he said, voice rougher than he intended. "I'm going home." Outside, the rain hit the city streets like static. Taxi horns blared, umbrellas bloomed, people hurried under gray skies, all part of a world that suddenly felt too fast, too meaningless. Elliot climbed into his car, fingers shaking as he turned the key. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm, matching his pulse. As the city fell behind, his thoughts turned to the last time he'd really seen Grace, not just looked at her, but seen her. She'd been 6, sitting in the garden with a jar full of lightning bugs. "Look, Daddy," she'd said, holding it up like treasure. He had smiled, half listening, too busy answering an email. He couldn't even remember what she'd done with those fireflies. He only remembered her eyes bright, waiting for him to notice. Now, 2 years later, that same voice had cracked over the phone, pleading for help. The thought struck him like cold metal. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the rain blurring the world into streaks of silver. Back at the mansion, Vivian was pacing near the piano. "She called him," she hissed, slamming her phone down. "After I told her not to." Derek raised an eyebrow. "And what? He's going to rush back because the little princess cried?" Vivian didn't answer. She stared out the window, watching lightning dance across the hills. "He's sentimental," she said finally. "He'll come, and when he does, he'll regret it." Alma overheard. Her heart sinking, she turned to Grace, who was sitting on the stairs, still clutching her locket. "Did you call your daddy, honey?" Grace nodded, tears welling up. "I didn't mean to make her mad." "Oh, sweetheart," Alma said softly, kneeling beside her. "You did the right thing. Daddies need to know when their little girls are hurting." The thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the windows. Grace flinched, but Alma pulled her close. "Hush now," she murmured. "Storms don't last forever." Ugh. Far away on the highway, Elliot's headlights cut through sheets of rain. He could barely see the road, but he didn't slow down. He kept hearing her voice, that trembling pleas repeating in his head. Somewhere between the mountains and the storm, he whispered into the dark, "Hold on, baby, I'm coming." The rain thickened as Elliot drove south, the highway a ribbon of gray beneath his tires. Each flash of lightning turned the world white for a heartbeat, then black again. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale against the leather. He didn't notice the ache in his shoulders or the steady thrum of the tires. His mind was far away back inside that quiet house, imagining his daughter's tears soaking the phone she had clutched in both hands. He turned on the radio just to hear a voice, any voice, but every station was static. So he talked to himself instead, the way people do when they're afraid. "Grace," he whispered, "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I should have known something was wrong." Rain splattered harder across the windshield, forcing the wipers to keep up a frantic rhythm. "You'll be okay, sweetheart. Just hold on. Daddy's coming." Miles away, the Blue Ridge Mountains rose like dark ghosts against the sky. The storm rolled over them, heavy and endless. Elliot could smell the wet earth through the vents, the scent reminding him of the night his wife had died, a night just like this. Rain and wind and sirens in the distance. He had sworn then he would always protect their daughter. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that promise, traded it for boardrooms and deadlines. Now, the road became his penance. He whispered the words again, the ones he hadn't said in years. "I love you, Gracie. I'm coming home." Inside the mansion, Lightning flashed through the windows, and the shadows danced on the walls. Grace sat on her bed, knees pulled to her chest, watching the door. She could hear voices downstairs, sharp, overlapping, angry. Vivian's tone rose like a whip. "Do you realize what you've done? He's on his way, Derek. He's actually on his way." Derek's voice followed, lazy but nervous. "So what if he is? You said you had everything under control." "I do," she snapped. "But not tonight. Not like this. He wasn't supposed to." She stopped mid-sentence, listening to the wind batter, the shutters. The sound seemed to echo through the walls. "He's coming back too soon," she whispered, her face tightening. Alma heard it from the hallway, pressing her hand to the wall as if steadying herself. She glanced toward Grace's door, then down the stairs where Vivian stood, framed by the lightning, her silk robe catching the light like a flash of ice. Alma felt the air change the way it does just before a storm breaks inside a home. Grace slid off her bed and crept to the window. The driveway stretched into darkness, rain glimmering in the headlights of the gate lanterns. She imagined her father's car coming around that bend, the sound of the engine cutting through the storm. She pressed her palm to the glass and whispered, "Please, hurry." On the road, Elliot's phone rang again. He answered without looking, his voice hoarse. "Grace?" But it wasn't Grace. "Mr. Harlan," said Daniel Whitmore, his old friend from Asheville, now a detective. "Alma called me. She's worried about the girl. You'd better get here fast." "I'm already on my way," Elliot said. "I won't stop until I see her." Daniel's tone softened. "Then drive safe, friend. Asheville's roads are slick tonight. Don't let the storm take you too." Elliot hung up, staring ahead into the darkness. The headlights carved a narrow path through the rain, every drop catching the light like tiny shards of glass. He thought about Grace's laughter, the way she used to chase fireflies on summer nights. He thought about the drawing she'd shown him the morning before he left a tree in the rain. For the first time, he understood what she had drawn, not sadness, but hope. He whispered to the memory of her voice, "Hold on, baby. Just hold on a little longer." The mansion's lights flickered. Vivian stood at the window, her reflection a pale ghost against the glass. "He's coming back too soon," she repeated more to herself than anyone else. The words trembled with something between fear and fury. Outside, thunder rolled again. Closer this time, a sound like the world taking a deep breath before it broke apart. The highway curved into the mountains, and the storm followed him there. Elliot Harlan's car crawled up the narrow road, its headlights cutting through sheets of rain that looked almost solid. The wipers squeaked with every desperate sweep, but still couldn't keep up. Every few seconds, thunder rolled across the valley, echoing off the hills like an angry drum. He hadn't been back to Asheville in over 2 years. The closer he got, the more the landscape changed, familiar pines rising like sentinels, old barns half hidden by mist. He could still remember driving this same route years ago with his wife, humming softly in the passenger seat, and Grace asleep in the back. The memory hurt now. He blinked hard, trying to see the road instead of what he'd lost. By the time he reached the town limits, the rain had turned into a steady curtain, glistening beneath the street lamps. The "Welcome to Asheville" sign appeared through the fog, worn but still standing proud, surrounded by red maples bending under the storm. Elliot slowed, breathing deeply. "Almost there," he whispered to himself. "Just a little longer." Back at the estate, lightning illuminated the house, pale stone, tall windows, shadows moving behind the curtains. Vivian stood at the top of the staircase, listening to the wind howling through the cracks. Derek paced near the window, uneasy. "He's coming in this weather?" Derek asked. "Yes," Vivian said, her voice low but sharp. "Because of her." "I am." She looked toward the closed door at the end of the hall, Grace's room. The child had fallen asleep again, curled up with her locket in hand. Alma had stayed beside her, humming quietly, her old fingers moving rhythmically through the girl's hair. Vivian turned away. "We need to make sure this looks proper." Derek frowned. "Proper?" She poured herself another glass of wine. "As if everything here is under control. I don't need him questioning how I run this household." "Ugh. And if he does?" Vivian's eyes gleamed coldly. "Then I remind him who kept his daughter alive while he was too busy building empires." Outside, Elliot's tires screeched as he turned into the long gravel driveway. The gate stood open, swaying slightly in the wind. He drove through, headlights gliding over the hedges and stone path. The house loomed ahead, a silhouette of wealth and emptiness. He killed the engine, stepped out, and immediately the rain drenched him, cold and relentless. He paused at the foot of the stairs, staring up at the front door. So many nights he had walked out without saying goodnight. Now he hesitated, soaked to the bone, his heart hammering as if to warn him, "This time, you can't walk away." The door opened before he could knock. Vivienne stood framed in the light, her hair perfectly styled despite the hour. "Elliot," she said, voice sweet but strained. "What on earth are you doing here? It's past midnight." He brushed the rain from his face. "Where's Grace?" "She's asleep," Vivienne replied. "You woke the whole house, darling. You should have called first." "I did," he said, his voice hardening. "She called me." Vivienne froze, only for a heartbeat, then smiled thinly. "Children exaggerate, Elliot. She's dramatic, just like her mother was." He stepped inside, water dripping onto the marble floor. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't compare her to anyone right now. Just tell me she's safe." "Ugh." Derek appeared behind her, a towel slung over his shoulder, pretending to look surprised. "Well, look who the storm dragged in." Elliot's jaw clenched. "You shouldn't be here," Vivienne interjected quickly. "He's my brother, Elliot. He's helping around the property. It's harmless." Elliot ignored her, moving past both of them toward the staircase. "Where is she?" "Upstairs," Vivienne said, her voice tight. "But you're scaring her if you storm in like this." Then she'll know I'm real," he answered, already halfway up the stairs. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the hum of rain against the glass. When he opened Grace's door, Alma startled awake in the chair beside the bed. "Mr. Harlan?" she gasped, pressing a hand to her heart. "Lord above, I thought I was dreaming." He exhaled slowly. "She's okay?" "Yes, sir," Alma whispered. "Just worn out. That little heart's been too heavy lately." Elliot knelt beside the bed. Grace stirred, blinking against the dim light. "Daddy," she whispered, voice small and unsure. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, his throat tightening. "I'm here now." She reached for him, tiny fingers clutching his wet sleeve. "I didn't mean to make her mad." "You didn't," he whispered. "You did nothing wrong." Alma wiped her eyes quietly, then looked toward the doorway where Vivienne stood watching, her face unreadable. "She shouldn't be disturbed," Vivienne said softly. "Let her rest." Elliot turned his head toward her. "She'll rest fine," he said, "now that I'm home." Vivienne's gaze flickered, a hint of panic behind the calm. For a moment, it seemed she might speak, but instead she turned away, her heels clicking down the hall. Behind her, the thunder rolled again, closer this time, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Elliot stayed beside Grace until her breathing softened into sleep again. The rain against the window eased into a rhythm that almost matched her heartbeat. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and felt a lump rise in his throat. The small bruise near her wrist caught his eye. It was faint, yellow at the edges, but enough to stop his breath. He looked to Alma, who sat quietly, hands folded. "How long has this been here?" he asked. Her eyes darted away. "Sir, please," he said gently, "tell me the truth." Alma hesitated, then sighed. "She's had hard days, Mr. Harlan. Mrs. Vivienne, she's strict. The girl works more than a child should." The old woman's voice trembled, as though speaking might break something fragile inside her. Elliot's hands tightened. "Strict?" he echoed. "You mean cruel." "I didn't say that," Alma whispered, eyes wet. "But you know how the house feels when you're not here. Quiet's not always peace, sir." Downstairs, Vivienne's heels clicked across the marble. She poured another drink, her reflection in the glass door faintly distorted by the rain. Derek was leaning against the counter, pretending to be calm but clearly shaken. "So he's back for good?" he asked. Vivienne's lips curled. "For now. But he won't stay long. He never does. Business, guilt, whatever he calls it, it always takes him away again." "And if it doesn't this time?" She looked up sharply. "Then I'll make sure it does." And a sudden knock startled them both. Elliot stood in the doorway, his coat still dripping. "We need to talk." Vivienne composed herself instantly, setting the glass down. "Of course," she said sweetly. "Though I'd prefer not to wake the entire house again. He stepped closer, eyes steady. Grace is hurt. Vivienne blinked, feigning confusion. Children fall, Elliot? She's clumsy. Not like that, he said quietly. And she called me, terrified. Em. For a moment, something cold flickered behind Vivienne's calm. Terrified? She repeated, smiling faintly. She's imaginative, just like her mother. Don't, he snapped, his voice low but sharp. Don't use her name to hide what you've done. Derek shifted uncomfortably. Maybe you two should stay out of this, Elliot cut in without looking at him. The storm outside punctuated the silence that followed. Vivienne's smile faded. You walk into this house after years away, she said softly, and dare to judge me? I was the one who kept her clothed, fed, and safe. Safe? He repeated. You call this safe? His voice cracked slightly, but not with anger, with heartbreak. She's afraid to breathe too loud. Vivienne turned away, picking up her wineglass again. If you're so certain of your sainthood, by all means, stay. See how long before you run back to your towers and meetings. He didn't answer. He just looked around the house, the polished surfaces, the cold order, the silence. None of it felt alive. None of it felt like home. When he returned to Grace's room, Alma was standing by the door. She'll rest now, the old woman said softly. You should too. I can't, Elliot murmured. Not yet. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Outside, the storm had broken. The rain slowed, thinning to mist. The driveway glistened under the porch light, and beyond the hedges, a shadow moved faint, quick, gone before his eyes could focus. He frowned, leaning closer to the glass. Did you see that? Alma shook her head. Just the trees, maybe. But Elliot wasn't convinced. The night had grown too still, too suddenly. The house exhaled a silence that felt alive, watching, waiting. He turned back toward the sleeping child, whispering a promise only she could hear. No one will hurt you again. Then, as the last drop of rain slid down the window pane, something else began to stir, not in the sky, but within the house itself. The rain had stopped, but something darker began to rise inside the house. Morning crept quietly over Asheville. The rain had stopped, but the world still glistened, driveways wet, pine needles shining, the mountains veiled in mist. From Grace's window, the lake below looked silver and still, like it was holding its breath. Elliot hadn't slept. He stood on the porch with a mug of black coffee, watching fog drift across the yard. The storm had cleaned everything but left a strange silence behind. A silence that didn't feel like peace. Inside, Alma moved softly through the kitchen, frying eggs the old-fashioned way, cast iron pan, butter crackling, smell of pepper in the air. You look tired, Mr. Harlan, she said. I've been worse, he replied quietly. But thank you, Alma. She hesitated, then reached into her apron pocket. Sir, there's something you should see. She handed him a small folded paper-lined notebook paper, torn from the corner of a page. It was a drawing Grace had made. 2 stick figures stood under heavy rain. One was small, crying. The other large, turned away. Written beneath, in uneven letters, Daddy forgot me. Elliot's throat tightened. His fingers trembled slightly. Where did she? I found it behind her dresser when I was cleaning, Alma said softly. She draws what she can't say out loud. He folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket. She won't ever have to draw that again. The front door opened, and Daniel Whitmore stepped inside, tall, mid-50s, with that quiet steadiness of a man who'd seen too much but still believed in decency. He wiped his boots on the mat and nodded. Morning, Elliot, he said. Heard you made it through the storm. Barely, Elliot answered. Thanks for coming. M. Daniel took off his hat, glancing around the immaculate hall. Place still feels the same, too clean, like it's hiding something. That's exactly why you're here, Elliot said, lowering his voice. Grace is hurt, bruises. She called me, crying. And Vivienne. Daniel raised a hand. Say no more! You think she's been mistreating the child? I know she has, Elliot said. I just can't prove it. Daniel studied him for a moment. Proof's a tricky thing. People like Vivienne don't leave fingerprints, they leave fear. Elliot nodded grimly. Then we find what fear left behind. They went upstairs. Grace was awake now, sitting at the window with her locket open, humming to herself. When she saw Daniel, she smiled faintly. "Hi, Uncle Dan." He smiled back. "Hey there, sunshine. You still remember me. Alma says you used to fix the broken gate." He chuckled. "That's right. I fix things when folks forget how." "Elliot, how are you feeling, sweetheart?" She looked down. "Better now that you're home." Daniel's gaze caught something near the door, a faint dent on the lower panel, just at the height of a child's shoulder. He crouched, running a finger over it. "She hit this spot often?" Alma nodded quietly. "Sometimes with the broom handle. Always said it was to teach discipline." Daniel sighed. "That's not discipline. That's cruelty." Downstairs, Vivienne was on the phone, pacing in the study. Her voice was sharp but controlled. "I don't care what it costs, Horace," she said. "I want the documents ready. The new trust clause. The full transfer." A pause. "No, he doesn't suspect yet. He's too busy playing the savior." Derek, standing nearby, leaned on the doorway. "You sure you want to keep playing this game? He's not the fool you think." Vivienne turned to him slowly. "You'd be amazed how long guilt can blind a man." Upstairs, Daniel lifted his phone and snapped quiet photos of the dented wood, the broken latch on the small desk, and a ripped page from a children's journal. "We'll need this," he said softly. Elliot nodded. "Do whatever you need." Grace tugged his sleeve. "Daddy?" "Yes, baby." She pointed to the closet. "That's where I hide when she's mad." Daniel opened it gently. Behind a row of dresses hung a small tin box, old and rusty. Inside, there were drawings, crumpled notes, and one small, cracked voice recorder, the kind kids use for fun. He pressed play. Static first, then a sound. Vivienne's voice, low but furious. "You will learn respect, Grace. Don't you dare cry again." Then the sound of something shattering, and Grace's muffled sob. Elliot's face went pale. The air thickened. "My God." Daniel clicked it off and slipped the recorder into an evidence bag. "That's enough for now," he said quietly. "We've got her words on tape." From the hallway, footsteps approached light, deliberate. Vivienne stood there, arms crossed, perfectly composed. "I assume you gentlemen have found something entertaining?" Elliot turned to face her. "You've hurt my daughter." Her smile never wavered. "Be careful, Elliot. Accusations can sound ugly coming from a man who abandoned his own child." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm ever had been. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the sound of rainwater dripping from the eaves broke the silence. Vivienne stepped further into the room, her smile still calm. "You've always needed a villain, Elliot. It makes forgiving yourself easier." He looked at her, exhausted. "This isn't about me anymore." Daniel's voice cut in, steady as stone. "Mrs. Harlan, we found a recording. Your voice, your words, that's evidence." Vivienne's mask flickered for an instant, then settled back in place. "You're trespassing, detective. And I'll have my lawyer called before lunch." Elliot took a slow step closer. "You hurt my daughter, and you call it teaching. You call it order. But you broke something far more fragile than furniture." Her expression hardened. "You left her alone with me, Elliot. What did you expect?" His breath caught, the truth landing like a blow. For once, he didn't argue. He just said softly, "You're right. I failed her first, but I won't fail her again." Vivienne turned, her face ghost pale. For the first time, she looked uncertain, not defeated, but human. She brushed past him, whispering, "You'll regret this." Daniel placed a firm hand on Elliot's shoulder. "Let her talk. We've got what we need." Elliot nodded slowly, eyes fixed on Grace's door. "No, Dan. What we need is peace." Outside, the morning sun began to pierce through the fog, a single ray landing on the child's window. The house was still, but something inside it had shifted a breath, a truth, a reckoning. Because the truth had a way of breaking through, no matter who tried to bury it. The house felt quieter than it had in years. No shouting, no slammed doors, only the creak of the floorboards and the soft hum of morning light through the curtains. Grace sat at the kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa that Alma had made just the way she liked, warm milk, extra marshmallows. Elliot stood nearby, watching her. It had been less than a day since the confrontation, but it felt like years of silence had cracked open. Grace's wrist was bandaged now, her locket resting on the table beside her. Every few seconds, she traced it with her thumb the way children do when something familiar keeps them safe. "Does it still hurt, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Grace shook her head. "Not much." He smiled faintly. "You're brave, you know that?" She looked up at him, hesitant. "Braver than you?" That made him laugh, not loudly, but the kind of laugh that shakes loose something tight in the chest. "Much braver than me." Alma turned from the stove, drying her hands. "You two sound good together," she said with a gentle smile. "It's about time this kitchen heard laughter again." Grace smiled shyly. "Alma says laughter makes food taste better." Elliot nodded. "Then we'll laugh every morning." And for a while, the three of them simply existed together, the smell of coffee and pancakes, sunlight spilling across the counter, the faint sound of a radio playing an old gospel tune in the corner. It felt ordinary, but to Elliot it was sacred. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of belonging. Then came the knock on the door. Daniel stepped inside, hat in hand. "Morning, folks," he said softly. "Sorry to interrupt." Elliot nodded. "You're always welcome. He looked at Grace and smiled. "Hey there, sunshine. You're feeling better?" She nodded, marshmallow foam still on her lip. Daniel's smile faded a little. "Elliot, mind if we talk outside for a moment?" They stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, filled with the smell of damp pine. Daniel leaned against the railing. "Vivienne's gone," he said quietly. "Packed a suitcase before sunrise. Left the house keys with her brother. He's gone too." Elliot stared out at the fog drifting over the lake. "So she ran." "Maybe," Daniel said. "Or maybe she just couldn't stand seeing what she'd done." Elliot nodded slowly, the news sitting heavy on his shoulders. "I don't hate her, Dan," he said after a long pause. "I thought I would, but I don't. I just pity her." "That's the first sign you're healing," Daniel replied. They stood there a while, listening to the birds starting up in the trees. The storm was gone, but its memory still lingered, puddles glittering in the driveway, the faint drip from the roof. Inside, Grace watched them through the window. She couldn't hear what they said, but she saw the way her father's face softened, the way Daniel rested a hand on his shoulder. For the first time in her young life, she saw her father not as a shadow behind business suits and phone calls, but as a man trying to make things right. She picked up her pencil and opened her sketchbook again. This time, she didn't draw rain or darkness. She drew three figures, herself, her father, and Alma, standing beneath a tree with its branches open wide like arms. Above them, she wrote in careful block letters, "Home." The afternoon sun drifted gently across the porch, warming the old wood beneath their feet. Elliot sat on the steps with Grace leaning against his side, her head resting on his arm. Alma hummed softly from the kitchen, her song carried by the breeze, an old hymn about mercy and coming home. Grace's eyes were half closed when she spoke. "Daddy, are you going away again?" He looked down, heart heavy but clear. "No, sweetheart, not this time." She tilted her head. "But your work, my work can wait," he interrupted gently. "You can't." She smiled, small and sleepy. "Then I forgive you." Those words hit him harder than any storm could. He blinked fast, swallowing the ache that rose in his throat. "You do?" Grace nodded, still watching the horizon. "Alma says forgiveness makes hearts lighter. I want ours to float." He couldn't speak for a long time. He simply wrapped an arm around her, the kind of embrace that said everything words never could. Later, as the sky turned gold, Alma brought out 3 plates of pie, the same apple hand pie she'd promised days ago. She handed one to Grace, one to Elliot, and kept one for herself. "Still warm," she said, smiling, "and made with laughter, just like I told you." Grace giggled. "Then it'll taste perfect." They ate in silence, watching birds skim the lake's surface. Each bite tasted of cinnamon, sugar, and something else, peace. Elliot glanced toward the house, its windows glowing softly in the fading light. "It's strange," he murmured. "For years, this place felt like a monument. Now it feels like a home again." Alma wiped her hands on her apron. "Homes remember kindness, Mr. Harlan. They just wait for it to come back." Grace finished her pie and leaned into her father's chest. "When Mama was here, she said love doesn't disappear. It just hides until we're ready to see it again." Elliot kissed her hair. Your mama was right. The wind shifted, rustling the maple leaves, scattering the last scent of rain. Somewhere far down the hill, church bells began to ring faint, steady, like a heartbeat. Elliot closed his eyes, letting the sound fill the quiet. There were things he still had to face: the investigation, the memories, the weight of years lost. But for now, with his daughter's small hand in his and the evening wrapping them in gold, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace that didn't need to be earned, only accepted. And as the light faded, Grace whispered, "It's a good day, Daddy." He smiled. "It's the beginning of better ones." Sometimes forgiveness begins not with words, but with quiet mornings like this. A week had passed since the storm, and the air over Asheville had turned crisp and gold. Autumn leaves drifted across the long driveway, whispering as they moved. The mansion, once heavy with silence, now carried the faint hum of life laughter from the kitchen, piano notes from the parlor where Grace practiced simple melodies Alma had taught her. Upstairs, Elliot stood in the hallway outside the attic door, holding a small box of Grace's old toys. He hadn't set foot there since his wife Clara died. The brass knob felt colder than he remembered. He hesitated, then turned it slowly. The door creaked open, releasing a breath of dust and cedar and something older memory. The attic was dim, lit only by sunlight pushing through a circular window. Sheets covered the old furniture like quiet ghosts. Elliot set the box down and looked around. Every corner held a story. Clara's easel, still speckled with dried paint. A rocking chair by the window. Grace's first baby blanket folded neatly in a trunk. He lifted the lid of the trunk and found more than blankets inside. Were photo albums, sketches, and a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. His breath caught. The handwriting on the top envelope was unmistakable. Clara Harlan. For a long time he couldn't move. His thumb traced the delicate loops of her handwriting. The letter was addressed simply, "For Elliot and for our little girl, when she's ready." He sat down in the old rocking chair, the attic floor creaking beneath him. His hands shook as he untied the ribbon and unfolded the first page. The paper was thin, edges yellowed, but her words were clear, calm, tender, and alive. "My dear Elliot, if you are reading this, it means I am gone and you are still here. I hope you've forgiven the world for being cruel. I hope you've learned to breathe again. You were always stronger than you believed, even when your silence made you seem cold. But please don't let that silence build walls between you and Grace. She will need you. Not the man who runs the company, but the man who hums when he fixes her toys. The man who once held my hand under the maple tree and promised to protect what we built together." Elliot's eyes burned. He blinked quickly, but the words blurred anyway. A soft knock startled him. "Daddy?" Grace's voice came from the stairs. "Alma said you were up here." He wiped his face quickly and smiled faintly. "Come in, sweetheart." She stepped into the attic, barefoot, her hair loose around her shoulders. "It smells funny up here," she said, wrinkling her nose. "It smells like the past," Elliot said softly. "And the past isn't always bad." Grace's eyes fell on the letter. "Is that from Mama?" He nodded. "Yes, she wrote it for us." She came closer, her small hand slipping into his. "Will you read it to me?" "Of course." He took a deep breath and began again, his voice trembling but steady. "Tell her I loved her before I ever saw her face. Tell her that love doesn't end when life does. It only changes shape. And when she feels alone, tell her to listen for music. I'll be in every song, every laugh, every quiet morning." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She leaned against him, listening as though the words were part of her heartbeat. The attic felt lighter, as if the letter itself had opened a window to let the air in again. When he finished, Elliot folded the letter carefully and handed it to her. "It's yours now," he said. "Your mother wanted you to have it." Grace held it close to her chest. "I think she still watches us." Elliot smiled faintly. "I know she does." Outside, a breeze swept through the pines, carrying the faint scent of rain and wood smoke. The sun dipped lower, bathing the attic in warm amber light. The shadows on the floor looked softer, now not like ghosts, but memories learning to rest. The light in the attic dimmed as evening settled over the valley. The golden hour turned the dust in the air into slow-moving sparks, like little souls dancing between the beams. Grace sat cross-legged on the floor, the letter open in front of her. lips moving softly as she traced each word again. "Daddy," she said after a while, "did Mama really write this before I was born?" Elliot nodded. "She wrote it the week she finished painting your nursery. She said every brushstroke was a prayer you'd grow up kind." Grace smiled faintly. "She must have known I'd need reminders." It laughed, a quiet sound. "We all do, sweetheart." There was a second page tucked behind the first. Elliot hadn't noticed it at first. The paper had stuck to the back of the envelope. He unfolded it carefully, the ink slightly smudged by time. Clara's handwriting was softer here, uneven, like she'd written it through tears. "Elliot, if grief ever turns you into stone, go back to where we first met, under the old maple tree near the lake. That's where I buried our first photograph, the one with the crooked smiles. I wanted it close to where we began, so that someday you'd remember how simple love used to be. And if you bring Grace there, tell her this. She was born into a story that never really ends." He stared at the words for a long moment, then looked at Grace. "Your mother left us a treasure," he whispered. "A piece of our beginning." Grace's eyes widened. "Can we go there?" "Tomorrow," he said. "When the sun's up." She nodded, satisfied, and carefully folded both pages back into the envelope.
"Then Mama can hear us,"
she said.
"if we read it under her tree."
Elliot's chest tightened with something between sorrow and peace. He rose, helping her to her feet, and together they left the attic. The steps creaked beneath their weight, but not in mourning. Rather like the house itself was breathing again, after holding its breath too long. Downstairs, Alma was setting the table for supper. She glanced up and smiled when she saw them.
"Find what you were looking for?"
Elliot met her gaze. "More than I expected," he said softly. Grace held up the letter. "Mama wrote to us." Alma's eyes misted. "Then she's been waiting for you to read it." They sat down together, the smell of roasted chicken filling the room, the kind of simple dinner that makes a home feel alive. Grace talked about the maple tree, about what she would say to her mother, and Elliot just listened every word, another thread sewing their family back together. Later that night, when the lamps were turned off and the house fell quiet again, Elliot stood by the window in his study, looking out toward the lake. The stars shimmered over the water like reflections of a promise. He touched the envelope in his hand and whispered, "Thank you, Clara, for bringing me home." Outside, a single maple leaf brushed against the window pane and drifted away into the night, carried by the same wind that once touched her hair. Some letters never end. They just wait to be continued by love. Morning came soft and clear. The storm was long gone, leaving the air fresh with pine and rain. Grace waited by the door, wearing her red boots and clutching her mother's letter. "Ready, Daddy?" she asked. Elliot smiled. "Let's go see her." They drove toward the lake in comfortable silence. The road curled through golden trees, and the light fell in stripes across the windshield. When they reached the clearing, Grace gasped softly. The old maple tree stood tall beside the water, glowing amber in the sunday. They walked beneath its branches. Elliot brushed aside the fallen leaves and found the spot Clara had mentioned in her letter, a small stone near the roots. Together they dug gently until a rusted tin box appeared. Inside lay a faded Polaroid. Clara and Elliot, younger, laughing under that very tree. Grace touched the picture with a trembling smile. "She looks happy." "She was," Elliot said quietly. "And she'd be happy seeing us here." They sat down together, the lake shining before them. Grace leaned against his shoulder, the letter on her lap. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them finally felt like peace. The breeze softened, carrying the faint scent of maple and lake water. Grace held the photo close, her eyes bright with wonder. "Daddy," she whispered, "can we leave something for Mama too?" Elliot smiled. "That's a beautiful idea." She took the envelope from her pocket, the letter they had read, and slipped a small drawing inside. 3 stick figures beneath a tree, hand in hand. Then she folded it carefully and placed it back into the tin beside the old photograph. Elliot covered it with soil again, pressing his palm to the ground. "She'll like that," he said softly. "It's our way of saying thank you." Grace nodded, her voice barely a breath. "Thank you for love." They stood for a moment longer beneath the golden leaves. The sunlight flickered between branches, touching their faces like a quiet blessing. The lake shimmered, the world holding its gentle stillness. Elliot looked down at his daughter, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Let's go home, sweetheart." Grace slipped her hand into his. "We already are." As they walked back up the path, a gust of wind lifted the fallen leaves, swirling them around the tree, and for a moment, it looked as though Clara herself was there, smiling in the sunlight. Some stories don't end. They simply find their way home. Sometimes, when the storms of life finally pass, what remains isn't silence, but clarity. Under the golden leaves of that maple tree, a father and daughter found not only a memory, but a beginning. The pain, the distance, the long nights of regret, all of it had led them back to a place where forgiveness was waiting. And maybe that's what love really is, a quiet return home after being lost for too long. Elliot learned that redemption isn't found in grand gestures or expensive apologies. It's built in small moments, in holding a child's hand, in making breakfast together, in choosing to stay. Grace, in her innocence, reminded him that love never truly leaves. It only changes its address. Together, they discovered that even after loss, a family can grow again, tender and whole, if it's watered with kindness and patience. To everyone listening tonight, perhaps you've known a storm or two of your own. Maybe there's someone you haven't called in years, or a memory you've tried too hard to bury. But love, like the sunrise over an old lake, finds its way back. It softens the hardest hearts, and it gives us the courage to begin again. The lesson is simple but timeless. Unconditional kindness can change the course of a life. Everyone deserves love and a place to belong. Compassion is worth more than wealth or pride, and true happiness begins when we choose to live for someone else. Like the porch light that burns quietly through the night, even a single act of goodness can guide us through our darkest roads. Maybe this story reminds you of something from your own life, a shared meal, a family photo, or a conversation that healed old wounds. Life, after all, is a collection of such small mercies. They're what hold us together when the world feels too big. So, dear friends, take a moment tonight to think about your own maple tree, that person, that place, that memory where love still lives. And if this story touched your heart, leave a 1-inch the comments. If it didn't, or if you'd like to share your thoughts, press 0 and tell us what you feel. And remember, stories like these aren't just tales, they're reminders. If this one brought a little light to your day, we'd be honored if you stayed with us for more. Because sometimes, all it takes to keep hope alive is a story told softly from one heart to another.